You probably wouldn't build a railway for bananas. You wouldn't carve tracks through mountains, build bridges across rivers, or send ships thousands of miles across the ocean just to move fruit. Unless the railway was never about the bananas. To understand why, follow this train. Every day, it cuts through the jungles of Central America, carrying hundreds of wooden crates toward the Caribbean Sea. Somewhere ahead, ships are already waiting. They won't wait forever, because the moment a banana leaves the tree, the clock starts ticking. Every hour it sits unmoved costs money. One missed connection can ruin an entire shipment before it ever reaches its customer. So this railway has to keep moving, across mountains, across rivers, through dense rainforest, until it reaches the coast. There, another race begins. The cargo leaves the train and moves almost seamlessly into waiting steamships. Within hours, those ships are heading toward ports thousands of miles away. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary supply chain, a railway, a port, a fleet of ships. But look closer. Every railway, every dock, every warehouse, every ship belongs to the same company. None of it exists by accident. The railway feeds the port feeds the ships feed the markets. Each piece makes the next one more valuable. Until something remarkable happens. The company isn't simply moving bananas anymore. It has built a system. And a company that owns the railway, the port, and the ships doesn't just control how goods move. Soon, it begins to influence who gets richer, who stays poor, what governments can do, and eventually, who remains in power. All because someone built a railway for bananas. The story doesn't begin with bananas. It begins with a railway. In 1871, the government of Costa Rica faced a challenge shared by many young nations in the 19th century. Its richest export, coffee, grew in the country's central highlands. Its biggest buyers waited across the Atlantic. Between the two lay mountains, dense rainforest, swollen rivers, disease, and hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness. Without a railway to the Caribbean coast, that coffee would never reach the world efficiently. So the government hired the American railroad entrepreneur Henry Meigs to build one. Meigs sent his 23-year-old nephew, miner Cooper Keith, to help manage the project. Neither man had any idea they were laying the foundations for one of history's most powerful corporations. The railway was supposed to unite a country. Instead, it nearly destroyed everyone trying to build it. The jungle fought every mile. Rain washed away freshly laid track. Floods swept away entire bridges. Landslides buried months of work overnight. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the camps. Thousands of workers died. Money vanished almost as fast as the men who spent it. The project became so expensive that Costa Rica itself began to buckle under the debt. For miner Keith, the problem wasn't theoretical. It was immediate. Every unfinished mile consumed more money. Every delay threatened the entire project. The question wasn't how to make a fortune. It was how to survive long enough to finish the railway. Costa Rica had a problem of its own. It owed Meigs's company, and increasingly Keith himself, far more than it could ever repay in cash. So, it paid in the only other currency it had: land. Vast tracts alongside the completed sections of railway were signed over to Keith, together with generous tax exemptions on whatever he chose to grow or export from them. At the time, it looked like a government settling a debt. History would remember it differently. Because that land, cleared for the railway and otherwise sitting idle beside it, happened to be ideal for banana plants. More importantly, it already lay beside the only railway capable of carrying those bananas to the Caribbean coast before they spoiled. In 1877, Keith began planting bananas. He wasn't trying to build a fruit empire. The bananas were never supposed to become the business. They were supposed to save the business. Then something happened that nobody involved had planned for. The bananas sold, and they sold remarkably well. On its own, the railway struggled to make money. On their own, bananas could never reach distant markets before they spoiled. Together, each made the other profitable. The railway made bananas valuable. The bananas helped finance the railway. One strengthened the other. A self-reinforcing system had been born. Costa Rica hired miner Keith to solve a transportation problem. He solved something else entirely. A debt crisis had handed one man vast stretches of land, generous tax concessions, and control over the country's most important transportation link. Not because anyone intended to build a corporate giant, but because every practical decision made the next one seem perfectly reasonable. Keith believed he had solved a railway problem. He hadn't. He had discovered a blueprint. A blueprint that would eventually give one company the power to influence far more than the movement of fruit, and far beyond Costa Rica itself. By the late 1880s, miner Cooper Keith had solved the problem that nearly ruined him. The railway survived, the bananas were profitable, and every year, more of them rolled toward the Caribbean coast. But Keith had discovered something else. Growing bananas was only half the business. Finding customers was the other half. Fortunately, someone else had already solved that problem. Nearly 3,000 kilometers to the north, in Boston, Massachusetts, another businessman had stumbled onto the same opportunity from the opposite direction. In 1870, Sea Captain Lorenzo Dow Baker arrived in Jersey City, New Jersey, with a cargo of bananas from Jamaica. The fruit sold almost immediately. Most Americans had rarely seen bananas before. Demand grew, faster than anyone expected. Baker soon partnered with Boston businessman Andrew W. Preston. Together, they built the Boston Fruit Company, importing bananas into the rapidly growing American market. But Preston faced the opposite problem from Keith. He had customers, but not enough bananas. Keith had bananas, but needed more customers. Neither business was complete. Separately, they were successful. Together, they could become something entirely different. In March 1899, those two worlds came together. Miner Keith's Tropical Trading and Transport Company merged with Andrew Preston's Boston Fruit Company. The new corporation was called the United Fruit Company. It sounded like another produce business. It wasn't. For the first time, one corporation controlled almost every step of the journey: plantations, railways, ports, warehouses, steamships, distribution. The banana no longer passed from one business to another. It stayed inside the same system from the moment it was cut until it reached the customer. That changed everything. Every shipment made the railway more valuable. Every railway made the plantations more profitable. Every plantation justified another ship. Every ship strengthened the distribution network. Every new investment increased the value of everything that came before it. The company wasn't simply getting bigger, it was becoming more connected. And that made it something competitors struggled to challenge. A rival could buy land. A rival could build a plantation. A rival could even purchase a ship. But competing against the entire network was another matter entirely. By the turn of the 20th century, United Fruit had begun expanding beyond Costa Rica. It acquired plantations across Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, and Panama. It invested in new railways. It expanded ports. Its ships became so recognizable, they earned their own name: the Great white fleet. The fleet didn't carry only bananas. It carried passengers, mail, general cargo. By the early 20th century, it had grown into one of the largest private merchant fleets in the world. To most people, United Fruit still looked like a fruit company. But if you stepped back, the picture looked very different. It didn't just own plantations. It owned the railways that served them. It owned the ports they depended on. It owned the ships waiting offshore. One company, one continuous system. What Miner Keith had discovered beside a struggling railway in Costa Rica had become something much larger. Not because someone designed it that way from the beginning, but because every practical solution created another opportunity. And every opportunity made the system stronger. The railway had been the beginning. The United Fruit Company was the finished blueprint. The next question would no longer be asked by businessmen. It would be asked by presidents. In 1898, a lawyer named Manuel Estrada Cabrera became president of Guatemala. He inherited a country rich in coffee, land, and agricultural potential, but poor in something far more useful: infrastructure. Guatemala City sat high in the interior. Its Atlantic coast opened toward the markets of Europe and the eastern United States. But between the capital and the Caribbean stood mountains, rivers, and an unfinished railway. The government had spent years trying to complete that line. It had never managed to finish it. For Estrada Cabrera, foreign investment offered a solution. American companies had money, engineers, ships, and access to the largest consumer market in the region. United Fruit needed something in return: land, transport, a port, and a government willing to grant the concessions that would connect them. In 1901, United Fruit established its first major foothold in Guatemala, developing banana operations in the fertile Caribbean lowlands around Izabal. The location was almost perfect. The soil was productive. The climate suited bananas. And Puerto Barrios offered access to the Caribbean Sea. There was only one problem. The railway connecting the coast to Guatemala City was still incomplete. For United Fruit, its plantations remained disconnected from the rest of the country. For Guatemala, its most direct route to Atlantic trade remained unfinished. Once again, a government and a corporation had different problems with the same solution. In 1904, interests led by miner Cooper Keith reached an agreement to complete and operate Guatemala's railway to the Caribbean. Keith had seen this pattern before. In Costa Rica, the railway had made bananas valuable, and the bananas had helped support the railway. Now, the same model was moving north. But Guatemala was different. This railway would not carry only company fruit. It would carry coffee from the highlands, imported machinery from the coast, passengers, mail, government supplies, and much of the trade moving between the capital and the Atlantic. The railway was being finished by private interests, but the country itself would depend on using it. That difference would matter. The same year, Keith and his investors organized a new railway corporation in the United States. It would eventually become known as the International Railways of Central America, IRCA. Two names, two charters, two separate sets of paperwork. But miner Keith had helped create both companies, and paperwork couldn't undo that. United Fruit provided enormous amounts of freight. The railway delivered that freight to Puerto Barrios, and the company's ships carried it north. Each business depended on the other, and each one made the other harder to compete with. In 1908, the railway between Guatemala City and Puerto Barrios was finally completed. After decades of failed construction, the capital was connected to the Caribbean. For Guatemala, it was a national achievement. Coffee, passengers, imports, and government cargo could now move between the interior and the Atlantic coast far more efficiently. For United Fruit, it completed another closed loop. Its plantations fed the railway fed the port, Puerto Barrios fed the Great White Fleet, and the fleet carried the company's fruit directly into the American market. The line had been built to connect Guatemala to the world, but the most powerful connection inside it belonged to United Fruit. And the system kept expanding. In 1912, IRCA consolidated control over most of Guatemala's major railway lines, including the country's only direct railway link to the Caribbean. The network now reached beyond one plantation district and one port. It connected regions. It carried national trade. It extended toward neighboring El Salvador. What had begun as a railway serving bananas had become part of the economic spine of Central America. That gave United Fruit a different kind of advantage. A competitor could still plant bananas in Guatemala's soil. It could still hire workers to harvest them. What it could not easily do was reach the Caribbean coast without using a railway closely tied to its largest rival. The company did not need to ban competition. The system made competing more expensive. By then, the pattern was becoming familiar across the region. Foreign companies supplied capital that governments could not easily raise themselves. In exchange, they received land, tax privileges, port access, and long-term contracts. At the beginning, each agreement solved a real problem. A railway was completed, a port was expanded, trade increased, jobs were created, but the value did not flow in only one direction. Every new concession made United Fruit more useful. Every useful service made the company more difficult to replace. And every government that inherited the arrangement found it harder to negotiate with the company than the government before it. In 1904, the American writer O. Henry published Cabbages and Kings, a collection of stories inspired by his time in Honduras. In it, he described a fictional Central American state as a banana republic. The phrase was not invented for Guatemala, and it did not simply mean a country that grew bananas. It described something more uncomfortable. A country whose economy depended heavily on a narrow export trade, while foreign businesses gained extraordinary influence over the systems that kept that trade moving. It was satire, but the relationship it described was becoming real. When Estrada Cabrera finally fell from power in 1920, United Fruit did not fall with him. The president who had welcomed the company was gone. The contracts remained, the plantations remained, the port remained, and the railway continued running. That was the clearest sign that the company's influence no longer depended on one political friendship. Presidents could be replaced. Infrastructure could not. Then, in 1928, the relationship became even harder to ignore. A new voting arrangement gave United Fruit a dominant influence over IRCA, the corporation operating Guatemala's principal railway system. The fruit company was no longer merely one of the railway's largest customers. Its influence now extended deep into the railway that carried much of Guatemala's Atlantic commerce. The plantations belonged to United Fruit. The bananas traveled on railways it influenced. They reached a port dominated by its commercial network, and they left aboard its own ships. The company still passed no laws. It commanded no national army. It held no seat in Guatemala's government. But every government now had to deal with the system it controlled. And soon, one government would decide that Guatemala needed another way to reach the world. In 1929, the world changed. The stock market crashed in October, commodity prices collapsed, international trade slowed. Even the banana business felt the shock. Weeks later, while financial markets were still unraveling, United Fruit moved to acquire one of its largest competitors, the Cuyamel Fruit Company. The deal brought an ambitious entrepreneur named Samuel Zemurray, into the corporation. He had built his own banana empire in Honduras by outmaneuvering much larger rivals, moving faster, taking bigger risks, and thriving where established companies hesitated. Now, he was joining the very corporation he had spent years fighting. Before the decade was over, he would be running it. United Fruit survived the depression that followed. Many others did not. Its plantations, its railways, its ports, its ships, its access to international capital. The blueprint Minor Keith had stumbled upon decades earlier was now doing exactly what great systems are designed to do. It absorbed shocks that destroyed smaller competitors. But Guatemala faced a different reality. Falling export prices weakened government finances. Economic hardships spread across the countryside. In 1931, General Jorge Ubico became president. Ubico admired efficiency, order, discipline. He also believed foreign investment was essential to Guatemala's economic future. His government worked closely with United Fruit. Existing concessions remained in place. The company's position inside Guatemala grew even stronger. For United Fruit, the 1930s were years of stability. For many Guatemalans, they were years of growing inequality. Across Central America, United Fruit controlled hundreds of thousands of acres of land. Much of it remained uncultivated. Meanwhile, many rural families owned little or no land at all. The imbalance was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then, the world changed again. The Second World War ended in 1945. Across Latin America, demands for political reform grew louder. Guatemala was no exception. The year before, in 1944, widespread protests forced Jorge Ubico to resign. For the first time in decades, Guatemala began moving toward democratic government. The election of Juan José Arevalo marked the beginning of what Guatemalans would later call the 10 Years of Spring. Arevalo was not trying to dismantle capitalism. He believed Guatemala could remain open to private investment while building stronger public institutions. His government expanded education, labor protections, public health, and political participation. For United Fruit, this was unfamiliar territory. For decades, the company had negotiated primarily with governments focused on attracting foreign investment. Now, it faced elected leaders asking different questions. Who benefited from the existing system? Who owned the land? Who controlled the railways? Who decided how Guatemala reached the outside world? When Arevalo's presidency ended in 1951, another democratically elected leader took office. His name was Jacobo Árbenz. Árbenz saw a different problem. Guatemala wasn't poor. It was dependent. Too much land sat unused. Too much trade depended on one railway. Too much commerce flowed through one port. Too much economic power rested inside one corporation. Árbenz did not begin by talking about bananas. He talked about competition. His government announced plans to build a new highway to the Atlantic, a modern public port, and a hydroelectric project that would reduce dependence on foreign-owned infrastructure. None of those projects required taking a single banana plantation. But together, they threatened something far more valuable: the system. For the first time in half a century, a Guatemalan government was no longer trying to work within the network United Fruit had built. It was trying to build another one. Then, on June 17, 1952, Jacobo Árbenz picked up a pen. With one signature, half a century of carefully built relationships would be challenged. The law was called Decree 900. Nothing would ever be the same again. On paper, it was an agrarian reform law. In practice, it challenged 50 years of accumulated power. Its purpose, stated plainly, was to redistribute uncultivated land to landless farmers while compensating owners for the property the government acquired. For Árbenz, the law was not simply about agriculture, it was about development. He believed Guatemala could never become economically independent while so much productive land remained unused. Roads could be built, ports could be expanded, railways could be challenged, but none of it would matter if millions of acres remained concentrated in the hands of a few owners, while much of the countryside lived without land of its own. To Árbenz, land reform was another piece of the same puzzle, building a more independent Guatemala. For half a century, one practical decision had quietly reinforced another. Árbenz was now trying to reverse that process. For United Fruit, the law looked very different. The company owned hundreds of thousands of acres across Central America. In Guatemala, significant portions of those holdings remained uncultivated. Under Decree 900, unused private land could now be expropriated, with compensation based largely on the value declared for tax purposes. That detail would prove explosive. For years, many companies, including United Fruit, had reported relatively low land values for taxation. Now, those same declared values became the basis for compensation. When the Guatemalan government moved to acquire more than 200,000 acres of United Fruit's uncultivated land, it offered compensation based on the company's own tax declarations. United Fruit argued the land was worth many times more. The Guatemalan government argued it was paying exactly what the company itself had declared it was worth. The disagreement was no longer about acreage, it was about authority. Who had the right to decide what private property was worth? A corporation or a sovereign government? Inside Guatemala, thousands of rural families welcomed the reform. Land that had remained idle for years was now being redistributed. To supporters, the law represented long overdue modernization. To critics, it represented a dangerous expansion of state power. The debate quickly escaped Guatemala's borders. United Fruit began lobbying aggressively in Washington. Its executives argued that Árbenz's government threatened American property and regional stability. The timing mattered. The early 1950s were no ordinary years. The Cold War was intensifying. The Korean War was underway. American policymakers increasingly viewed political events around the world through one overriding question. Could communist influence be expanding? Guatemala suddenly attracted attention far beyond Central America, not because of bananas, but because of what its struggle had come to represent. Land reform, foreign investment, property rights, national sovereignty, Cold War strategy. Each side believed it was defending something fundamental. Árbenz believed Guatemala had the right to reshape its own economy. United Fruit argued its investments were being unlawfully threatened. Officials in Washington increasingly viewed the situation through the lens of global rivalry with the Soviet Union. The conflict was no longer between one government and one corporation. Three different stories had become one. A young democracy trying to redefine its economy. A multinational corporation defending a business system built over half a century. And a superpower convinced that events in a small Central American country might carry consequences far beyond its borders. None of them saw the conflict in quite the same way. That difference would shape everything that followed. By the end of 1952, the debate had already moved from Guatemala City to Washington, and onto the desks of men who no longer saw the crisis as a dispute over land. They saw something else, something far more dangerous. Among them was the newly appointed Director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles. By 1953, the argument had changed. It was no longer taking place in Guatemala's Congress, or in United Fruit's boardrooms. It had reached Washington. For United Fruit, the stakes were obvious. Decree 900 threatened land the company believed it legally owned. Its executives argued that Guatemala's government was violating property rights and creating a dangerous precedent for American investment overseas. They took that argument directly to the United States government. But another story was unfolding at the same time. The Cold War was reshaping how American officials interpreted events around the world. China had fallen to communist rule in 1949. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. The Korean War had erupted in 1950. In Washington, many policymakers no longer looked at political disputes in isolation. They asked a different question. Could this become another opening for Soviet influence? Guatemala suddenly appeared on that map, not because Soviet troops had arrived, not because the country carried outsized strategic weight on its own, but because American officials increasingly believed it was drifting toward communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. Whether that assessment was accurate remains debated by historians. What mattered was that influential people in Washington believed it. Among them were Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence. Both had previously worked at the New York law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which had represented United Fruit in legal matters before they entered government. Historians continue to debate how much those past professional connections influenced later decisions. What is not debated is that the interests of the corporation and the concerns of the American government were now moving in the same direction. Inside the CIA, officials began planning a covert operation. Its codename was Operation PBSUCCESS. The objective was not to defeat the Guatemalan army. It was to convince the Guatemalan army that it had already been defeated. The agency recruited Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan army officer living in exile. His force was small, far too small to defeat the Guatemalan army in a conventional war. That was never the plan. The most powerful weapon wasn't the airplanes, it wasn't the soldiers, it was uncertainty. CIA aircraft flew limited bombing missions against selected targets. Radio broadcasts claimed that a massive liberation army was advancing. Rumors spread faster than facts. Every explosion sounded larger than it really was. Every broadcast made the invading force seem bigger than it actually was. Confusion became a weapon. The objective was to make resistance seem hopeless before the fighting truly began. In June 1954, Castillo Armas crossed into Guatemala with only a few hundred men. On paper, the invasion looked weak. But paper wasn't what mattered anymore. Perception was. Inside Guatemala City, uncertainty spread through the government. Military officers questioned whether the United States would intervene more directly. Some doubted whether victory was even possible. Others began withdrawing their support. The real battlefield had moved inside people's minds. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Árbenz resigned. He later argued that overwhelming external pressure had left his government with no realistic path forward. Castillo Armas entered Guatemala City days later. A few hundred men had not conquered Guatemala. They had convinced enough people that Guatemala had already been conquered. The railway still ran, the ports still operated, the ships still sailed. The system built over half a century had survived its greatest challenge. Guatemala had changed governments. The infrastructure of power had not. The operation had succeeded. United Fruit had survived. Its land remained protected. The government that challenged its position was gone. From the company's perspective, the immediate crisis had passed. But history rarely sends only one bill. Carlos Castillo Armas became Guatemala's new president. Many of Árbenz's reforms were reversed. Large portions of the redistributed land returned to their previous owners. Decree 900 disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. The alternative highway stalled. The competing Atlantic port was abandoned. For a moment, it looked as though the system had won. But systems have lifespans too. The political divisions exposed by 1954 never truly disappeared. Over the following decades, Guatemala descended into coups, military rule, insurgency, and civil war. The conflict lasted 36 years. More than 200,000 people were killed or disappeared. Most of them had nothing to do with the decisions that began this story. That is where many versions of this story end, with a coup, with a civil war, with the human cost. But if this documentary has been about anything, it has been about systems. So there is one final question worth asking. What became of the system itself? The world kept changing. Container shipping transformed global trade. New competitors entered the banana business. Governments became stronger. The advantages that had once made United Fruit almost impossible to challenge slowly began to disappear. In 1970, the company became United Brands. Years later, it became Chiquita Brands International. The corporation survived. The system that had made it extraordinary did not. Looking back, it is tempting to think this is simply the story of a banana company. It isn't. Bananas happened to be the product. The real story was infrastructure. The railway, the port, the ships, the distribution network. Control enough of the system, and you no longer compete like everyone else. That pattern did not disappear with United Fruit. It keeps returning. Today, Microsoft does not own the millions of businesses that rely on its technology. But millions of businesses build their work around Windows. They collaborate inside Microsoft 365. They run critical workloads on Azure. Developers build software through GitHub. Piece by piece, Microsoft became part of the infrastructure that countless other businesses depend upon. That does not make Microsoft another United Fruit. The legal framework is different. The competitive landscape is different. The political environment is different. But the strategic lesson is remarkably familiar. The companies that shape history are often not the ones selling the most products. They are the ones that quietly become part of everyone else's system. The railway was never built to overthrow a government. It was built to move coffee. The bananas were planted to help pay for it. Everything else followed, one practical decision at a time. One railway, one concession, one port, one fleet, one merger, one law, one covert operation. None of those decisions by themselves changed history. Together, they built a system. And systems are powerful because no single piece looks extraordinary. It is only when every piece connects that history begins to move. And once that system became powerful enough, it didn't just move fruit, it moved history.